JordsWoodShop is sponsored by Minwax and by I Would Like. Check out their products at iwouldlike.com. So a few months ago I got a new mattress and decided my old bed frame wasn't good enough for it and I would make my own frame. Well, I managed to throw away my frame pretty quickly, but I only just got around to building a new bed frame. My original plan was to build a platform style bed frame a little bit like this, but as you will soon see, that plan changed quite dramatically a few hours into the build. I'm using black butt that I milled myself for this build, and as you can see it's still pretty rough and needs some machining to make it look pretty. To make things easier, I marked out all the components on the rough stock and cut everything down to its rough dimension. This makes everything easier to handle and also means we won't have to remove quite as much material while milling it to get it flat. With everything cut down, I took it over to the Minwax and flattened two faces of every board. You might notice I'm not running anything over the jointer like I usually would here, and that's because these boards are already pretty flat, and I don't really care about a little bit of bowing on pieces this size, and to be honest, a bit of twist doesn't worry me either. Once I had everything milled, I trimmed and ripped everything down to its final size. You can see I have a new toy in the shop here which is my new 52-inch saw stock contractor, and I really love this saw. Keep your eyes open for a few videos on the assembly and use of that in the future, but I gotta tell you, it is great having a table saw again. I like to use a sled wherever possible for crosscuts as it's super accurate, but for the longer pieces I'll still use my miter saw as it's far easier to handle. It was here where my original design proved it wouldn't quite work, not because any construction restraints, but because of size. This was going to be way too big for my bedroom, so it was back to the drawing room. This is kind of what I came up with, something that was super low profile, slightly Asian inspired, and more importantly, something that could still use all the materials I had already milled. To make this new design work, I had a bit of work to do. While the rails could be salvaged, the 200 by 25mm stock I was going to be using for the legs just wouldn't work for me. So out came some chunkier wood and 4 new legs were born. You can see here there are 2 different lengths being cut. The short ones are for the front and the long ones are for the back. The rails had to be quite a bit narrower, so I ripped them down to 110mm wide at the saw, and then with the offcuts I glued them back onto the rails to not only add some thickness and strength, but also act as a slat support later on. You can see here the rear legs have a bit of an angle to them where the headboard attaches. To get this angle I tilted the blade of the table saw to 4 degrees and cut the top section of the legs off. Then by flipping the offcut over, we are left with an 8-degree angle which is perfect for a headboard. To hold things together and add a bit of strength, I also added a couple of 10mm dominoes to the joint and glued it up. Dowels would be fine here too. The headboard is made from a single piece of wood that has one live edge. Like the rest of the piece, I cut this down to rough length, milled it to have 2 flat faces and 1 straight edge, and then cut it to its final size. By this stage it was the next day and everything was out of the clamp, so I took it over to the bench, laid everything out so I could get a feel for what it was going to look like, and once I knew I was happy, I laid out the locations for a couple of dominoes and cut all the mortises. Once I saw everything sitting as it would be in the end, I knew I wanted to do some more work to the back legs. Having thick chunky legs with such an elegant headboard looked a bit out of place, so I traced the thickness of the headboard onto the legs, drew a taper and cut it out on the bandsaw. This looked a lot better, but I still wanted to refine it a bit more, this time on the face of the leg. So I marked out yet another taper, took it all apart once again, and then it was back over to the bandsaw. From here there was no turning back, so I took the legs over to the bench, cleaned them up with a block plane, and then sanded them smooth. And there we have it, something that looks a lot more appropriate for the low stance of this project. With the headboard done, I cut the mortise in the other leg assembly, sanded everything to 120 grit to cut down on sanding later, and glued up the 2 assemblies. Once the glue had dried for a few hours, I took the clamps off, cut the mortises in the long rails and either leg assembly, and I could finally see what the overall look was going to be. The long rails obviously aren't glued into place in case the bed needs to be broken down for transport or storage, so the dominoes are simply being used for alignment. So holding it all together are these blocks that I glued and screwed onto the rails that bolts can go through and tie everything together. Now I'm using these nut inserts designed for wood in all the legs, but lag screws could probably do an okay job here too if you can't source this hardware. The last thing that needed to happen was installing the center slat support. For this I just made 2 U-shaped brackets at the table so that the support could just drop into, and I also notched out the support so that it would sit level with the side slat supports. Once that was good, I glued and screwed the brackets into place and everything was looking good. With everything looking good, I took everything apart once again and gave everything a thorough sanding to 180 grit and applied my go-to finish. This is of course the Minwax wipe-on poly. Applying this is really simple. I find I get the best results when I only apply a really light coat and don't allow anything to pool on the surface for too long before I wipe it off. It gives me a really nice close to the wood feel and a really nice sheen. I did 4 coats all up. Once everything had dried, I was pretty much done. I put everything back together to make sure the finish didn't interfere with anything's fit. I added the slats, which I saved from my old IKEA bed frame, and then the last thing I did was make a block that would sit under the center slat support to help aid in remove any sagging over time. And there it is, a beautifully simple bed that went from a rough design to a complete making it up as I go along build. Overall, I'm pretty happy with it. It took about 3 days to build with a lot of stopping to figure out what I wanted to do next, and while there is some pretty big design changes in there, it went pretty smooth. So hopefully this video gives you more of an idea of my process when building a new project like this, and also gives you a few ideas. Now, like always, thanks for watching, and if you've enjoyed this video, give me a thumbs up down below, and also maybe leave a comment. And if you haven't already, make sure you click that subscribe button so you stay up to date with all of my woodworking videos here on YouTube. And like always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.